Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director for Brexit at the Institute, and I'm very delighted that we've finally managed to entice Nick Boles MP to come and join us on the stage. We realised that we were pursuing the wrong strategy when we kept on inviting Nick to breakfast events. Then we finally spoke to his office and said Nick would be delighted to come as long as we allowed it to be slightly later in the day. So welcome to Lunchtime with Nick Boles. Nick Boles, for all of you who know him, is the Independent Progressive Conservative, is those all the right names, MP in a party of one for Grantham and Stamford. He was, until earlier this year, the Conservative MP for the same constituency until he dramatically walked across the floor or whatever to guys or to sounds of colleagues yelling, "Don't go, Nick," as he was frustrated at the inability of Parliament to find a compromise on Brexit. But Nick is a very long-standing friend of the Institute for Government. Shortly after the Institute was founded, as some of you will have been at IFG's IFG 10 events a couple of weeks ago, Nick was our first political fellow, and I think our most distinguished political fellow around. Thinks were there other political fellows, but Nick gave us huge help in providing some early insight into the Cameron regime when David Cameron became Prime Minister in coalition government back in 2010. So maybe we just start there, Nick. So back in 2010, David Cameron elected, new MP, had told his party that the secret to their success was to stop banging on about Europe. Maybe you'd just like to explain to the rest of us how we've gone from there to a situation in 2019 when, frankly, almost no other issue can get any bandwidth apart from Europe. What has happened to British politics, and to what extent does David Cameron and the Conservative Party have to take responsibility for where we are now?
Well, thank you, Jill, and it's great to be back, and thank you for catering to the fact that I'm a grumpy sod before 10 a.m. So I always think that I should avoid all engagements because I'll only end up being rude to somebody. At lunchtime, hopefully, I'll be a little more genial. I don't want to sort of go over what is very well discussed ground about, how it came about that we held the referendum and seeing off UKIP and all of that sort of stuff. And I'll try and perhaps dig into the sort of deep cultural roots of this. And I think that there are two things going on, one of which perhaps to some extent absolves David Cameron and the Conservative Party, but the other of which squarely puts them back in the dock. The theory that I have that to some extent absolves them is that I think that the European question, the question of what relationship we have with the people and the countries to our east, is the defining issue for British and indeed English statecraft for at least 1,000 years. And that for all of those 1,000 years, we've been trying out different approaches. We tried marriage, we tried invasion and conquest, we tried balance of power, playing one off against the other, politics. And one of the things that we can discover if you take a step back is that no model works for much longer than about 40 years. All of those models worked for about 40 years, and sometimes maybe a few more, and sometimes a few less, but none of them last for very long. And that the EU, membership of the EU, was just our latest attempt to find a new kind of relationship with the people and the land to our east. And we've always been beset by that same sort of yin and yang of, on the one hand, not wanting them to go off and do whatever they wanted and have to live with the consequences, but on the other hand, not to get too involved. And the breakdown of our European Union membership as a long-term project, I believe was, on some long-term historical perspective, inevitable. Because once the European Union had stopped focusing mainly on market integration, which we brilliantly, Margaret Thatcher brilliantly, and Lord Cockfield brilliantly managed to distract them with for fully 2 decades, But once they had got back to what they always were going to do, and this is where there was a dishonesty in the debate in the first referendum, it was always a political project for them. There was never any doubt about that, and it was simply the British elite decided to lie to the British people and say, no, it's just a common market. So once they got on with the political project, that is when I think probably it had an expiry date, and it was a question of when. So to that extent, I think you can say this is a broad sweep of history, and the Tory party was just riding it. But then now to be a little bit more critical. The Conservative Party, obviously, by its very nature, is more concerned with sovereignty and nation, perhaps, or self-consciously concerned about them than other parties in Parliament and in our political system, and prides itself on being the defender of both of those things. But also, bluntly, it is now a party of old, rich people. Now, I use both the word old and the word rich loosely, but most people who are members of the Conservative Party no longer have a mortgage, own their own home, no longer have a mortgage. Most of them have a full pension pot. Most of them have literally no connection, other than through their pension investments, with the world of work or the world of commerce. And they are driving the politics of our governing party. And it's not to criticise them, because I think it's completely legitimate for people in their older years to have political views and express them, and for those political views to be different and have a different perspective on life than that of younger generations. It's no criticism of the individuals concerned for expressing their views, but what is my criticism is that the Conservative Party leadership and the Conservative MPs in Parliament should not see it as their role as to represent only the views of Conservative Party's members in the governance of our country. It should be their role to, at the very minimum, represent the views of Conservative and potential Conservative voters, and that's just the minimum. And frankly, it would be quite nice if they'd give half a thought to other voters too, people who are never going to vote for them. And what has happened is, and I don't think this is unique to the Conservative Party, though it is causing unique pain and grief to all of us because the Conservative Party is in government, but what has happened is that the system of political parties with membership, with narrow membership, with real power, is causing a fundamental break between political leaders and the people and the country. And personally, I think that until we get away from that, until we move beyond party membership controlled political parties, we will find that we'll be in one version or another, because, you know, let's say we've eventually no longer have a Conservative government and we have some version of a Labour government. Well, by God, are we going to experience the same thing all over again, just in a different direction? Another small cabal of totally unrepresentative people who have very little in common with the broad mass of the people will be requiring it through endless composite motions in the Labour Party conference, the country to head in a direction it doesn't want to go.
That's very interesting. So actually what we're seeing that playing out now is with the Conservative leadership contest that we see is basically people tuning their political preferences to the base of the Conservative Party, that very narrow selectorate rather than anything else. I'm quite interested, you were talking about the sort of party system being sort of broken. You, of course, tried in Parliament, what triggered your walkout, to broker some sort of cross-party compromise. And people looking at the UK from Europe, where people are used to forming coalitions, say one of the reasons we found it so difficult to solve this is because of our sort of way Parliament's set up, things like that. Do you like to share with us sort of your reflections on Parliament, the way parties in Parliament interact, based on your attempts to actually try to find a way out of the Brexit impasse?
I have to say, I think that is the most appallingly lame excuse.
Okay.
I mean, we managed, and this was in the times when I was proud to be a Conservative, you know, we managed to put together a coalition with a full-blown coalition agreement that survived 5 years in the space of a weekend.
Yeah.
And the whole senior civil service, I happen to know, said it couldn't be done. And it was going to be impossible. It was going to take weeks and weeks and weeks, and we couldn't keep Her Majesty waiting that long, and you know, etc., etc. And the fact is, these two parties that have been knocking 7 bells out of each other only days before sat down in a room, went through their respective manifestos, and knocked up a coalition agreement of quite some detail. I mean, maybe not as the detail that you sometimes see in coalition agreements on the continent, but a lot of detailed policy, including entirely new policies like, you know, on a change in the voting system and a referendum on that. So the truth is that with leadership, of course we can do cross-party working. This idea that just because we sit opposite each other and shout at each other means that we can't do cross-party working is frankly pathetic. The point is we didn't have leadership. If Theresa May had either in 2016, which would have been the best time to do it, or in 2017, which still would have been, you know, enough time, if she had said, right, okay, we're going to have to do this on a cross-party basis, let's sit down and work out what you really care about, what we really care about, we would now be members of the EEA and EFTA in some form, we'd be in the single market, we'd be out of the common agricultural policy, and Nigel Farage would be sitting in Florida drinking too much with Aaron Banks. You know, it would be very bliss to be alive. And that would have happened if the Conservative Party had had a decent leader, which it never had, under Theresa May, and if she had had the courage to recognise that on something as dramatic as this, that just as, you know, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee realised you couldn't take a country to world war on its own for a brief period without a cross-party coalition. Similarly, you can't break its 50-year relationship with Europe without a cross-party coalition. If she had done that, and okay, it would have been tricky with Jeremy Corbyn, you know, things would not have been straightforward, but there are enough Labour MPs who would have risen to the challenge. In the early weeks after David Cameron resigned, after the referendum, Oliver Letwin was still in the Cabinet Office, and David said to him, listen, because we thought that the leadership contest was going to last for a longer period, David said, why don't you get things sort of started and started getting people thinking about this? And one of the first things he did was invite Yvette Cooper and a couple of others in to start talking about how might a cross-party process work, and would it be a special cabinet committee, or would it be a grand commission, or what might it be? If we had started off on that route, we'd be out by now, and we would not be having this nightmare. It's not because we sit opposite each other in an ancient chamber.
But not a single one. I mean, David Cameron could have actually done what he said he would do before the referendum and stay, overseen that. Not a single person, as far as I can remember, put themselves up in that Conservative leadership contest. George Osborne didn't think he could win, didn't stand, etc. Actually presented themselves as the sort of person who might have tried to offer that sort of perspective, sort of uniting perspectives, as opposed to what I think one of Theresa May's director of strategy described as a process of privatising and wholly owning Brexit, you know, for the Conservative Party to become the party of the 52%.
This is the fault, the active fault of individuals. David Cameron for cutting and running, for being throwing his toys out of the pram. It's the active fault of Theresa May, who was, of all people, well placed to actually try and bridge both sides, because she hadn't voted for Brexit, but she clearly did believe that it needed to be delivered, who actually, for all that she's not a personable person, had perfectly good relationships with people like Yvette Cooper and others who she could have worked with. It's individuals who have brought us to this point. And they will be held accountable by history, if not by, something more draconian.
So one of the things we've seen in the Conservative Party is that there's very clear sort of division of opinion. People are moving to, as you said, to where they think the sort of centre of gravity of the membership is, but there are some people who you look and think, how on earth can they still be in the Conservative Party? So people who said they won't, may not stay, depending on who becomes leader. Things. I mean, does the Conservative Party itself have, or indeed deserve, a future? Can it actually reunite around things, or is Brexit sort of existential threat to the Conservative Party?
I mean, I think people have, put it this way, nobody's ever won any money on predicting the demise of the Conservative Party. I mean, people have written books about it and it always comes back. So in that sense, I think that, you know, it represents a body of not just of opinion, but of sort of deep culture, tradition, attitude, that, you know, in an ancient and free country, there's quite a lot that's worth hanging on to. And let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater. That is the normal Conservative position. Cue hollow laughter as we throw not just the baby out of the bathwater, but the entire family through Brexit. So I don't think it will necessarily disappear, but I think it is overdue a very long time in the wilderness while it works out what on earth it actually believes in, and whether a broader, more balanced set of priorities rather than an ideological obsession might not serve them better. Normally one could view that with equanimity. You know, normally in our political system, when one of the parties has gone bonkers, the other party is just beginning to sober up. And so therefore, even if you don't vote for the party that's currently sensible, you at least, I mean, I remember on May the 1st, 1997, that incredibly beautiful day, you know, I had voted Conservative, and I was as overjoyed as everybody by the change that had taken place and by the hope and that it offered. And that used to be how we lived. Now we have this awful position where we have a party of government which is entirely unfit and incapable of governing responsibly for the whole nation. And we have a party of opposition which is quite possibly worse.
So, moving on from that, we potentially face the position in the autumn where Parliament, I think Hilary Benn was on Newsnight last night after John Bercow didn't select the amendments today. I think he's not selected them today as well, from Dominic Grieve and Margaret Beckett trying to attach the no-deal rider to the estimates. Hilary Benn saying Parliament will face a big crunch in the autumn if it really wants to stop no deal. And we've seen huge amounts of, sort of normalisation of no deal from both candidates and posturing on how readily they are to embrace it. But Matthew Parris wrote at the weekend, I think, that the Remainers were sort of giving up the ghost and just deciding that actually, and we saw people saying, you know, well, Corbyn's even worse than no deal and we can't risk Corbyn if we're Conservatives and things like that. So do you think Parliament's really got the stomach, particularly your colleagues, really got the stomach to stop no deal? And if so, how's it going to do it?
Well, it is obviously the thing over which I and many others are vexing more than anything else. The first thing to say is the last attempt, which is, for those of you who don't follow it closely, was the opposition day motion to grab a day of the order paper and then pass a bill like we did before. That was always, I felt, not that I didn't support it, I did support it, but it was always, I felt, unlikely to succeed for two quite fundamental reasons. Firstly, it was a motion of the leader of the opposition. And asking Conservative MPs to vote for a Jeremy Corbyn motion is a tougher ask than asking them to vote for a motion that I've put forward, or Oliver Letwin, or Hilary Benn, or Yvette Cooper. Secondly, the timing of it was unfortunate, and I tried hard to argue for the opposition day to come 3 weeks later, once the Conservative Party leadership election had got down to the final two, by which point, say, the supporters of Rory Stewart might have thought, well, to hell with it, this is clearly not going anywhere that I want to go, so I'm willing to take a stand. The problem is it came right at the start of the leadership contest, so you had a lot of people who might be sympathetic to the cause, who didn't want to undermine the candidate they were supporting by publicly supporting Jeremy Corbyn. So I think it was doomed to fail, and it failed by 11. That, in a sense, suggests that it should be possible to win at a more opportune time. The problem, though, is, I think, threefold. Firstly, importantly, you say that there has been a normalisation of the idea of no-deal Brexit, and that's clearly true, not just within the Conservative Party, not just within the right-leaning media, but more broadly, and presumably it will continue through the summer. Secondly, you have the people who we refer to, and I don't know if they refer to themselves as respect the result. The respect the result group of Labour MPs, those mainly representing constituencies that voted leave overall. They're much crosser with the leader of the opposition's office than they were. So previously they'd gone along with stuff because they thought that that Jeremy Corbyn was going to hold out against a second referendum, which they don't want at all. And now they feel that the response to the European elections has been to indicate that the Labour Party is basically going to end up backing a referendum in all circumstances. So they are much less likely to go along with a Labour whip than they were back in March when we did this the first time. And you saw that there was, I think there were half a dozen people who voted against their own leader of the opposition's motion, and then quite a number more who abstained. And though it's not quite clear which of the abstentions were paired and which were not, nevertheless it was a biggish number. And then, of course, the third element is, in the autumn, how many Tories will be willing to defy the whip, defy the new Prime Minister, vote not for a leader of the opposition's motion, because if we find something, it won't be that again. How many of them will there be? And I think that it's going to be very, very unpredictable. I think we have a chance of getting more, but only, and this is why I personally didn't feel that the approach on the estimates was the right one, is there will be a sense among Conservative MPs that you've got to give the new Prime Minister a chance, but you mustn't run out of time. And so what does that mean? I think it probably means you've got to give them August to talk to whoever's not on their sun lounger, and allow them to come back at the beginning of September and say what's going on. Where, of course, what will become very, very difficult is if they come back and say, talks all going swimmingly, haven't yet quite got a conclusion, I'll be back to you in October, because then we're beginning to run out of time. So that is where I think it's either the early September or it's early October is the moment. But, we have to find a route, and unless, Jill, you have put one up at the Institute for Government, it's not entirely clear what that route is.
I think we're thinking that that the Speaker is the person that you need. That you either have a vote of no confidence.
Yeah, no, that's not a route. That's an
is,
alternative. It's not a route.
Which isn't a route, which is the last resort, you might say. Or you have to look to the Speaker to be suitably creative and let you do things that.
And so the only insight I would give you is that the way it has to work is this. You have to go to the clerks and say, we want to do this, can we? And then they are absolutely the total Rolls Royce, absolutely fantastic. But what they cannot do is say, why don't you do this? And nor can the Speaker. He can nod and wink as much as he likes, but we actually have to work it out. And it is not, I promise you, it is not obvious, because we had a route and the route was very specific. And it all related to the Section 13 of the Act and all of that. That's all gone. It's all gone. So we need a brand new route. So don't assume that John Bercow has got something prepared sitting in his safe, waiting to unveil it at the key moment. We have to build something, take it to his people and him ultimately, and have them say, yes, we think we can make this work.
No, well, we thought MPs were getting a bit too complacent about how easy it would be to stop no deal in the autumn, because they forgot that it was the fact the Prime Minister wanted a deal through that gave them all those
No, I think you're right. So I think we may not have the numbers and we may not even have a route. my current assessment.
And if it came down to no confidence vote in the end?
So I don't know the answer. I'm very clear that if the new Prime Minister was proposing to take us out without a deal, then I would vote no confidence in him. But I'm no longer a Conservative, and that in the sense of the logic of my journey. It's an enormous step for a Conservative MP. I mean, it means your chances of fighting the seat again in the next election, which will presumably quite likely to follow very swiftly, is very slim. Very slim, 0. So it's got to be now. Maybe if you're Dominic Grieve and you've already slightly fallen out with your association and you've had a distinguished career and you're. But what's amazing is don't underestimate how many MPs desperately want to remain MPs at any price. I mean, I find it bizarre, but they do.
I mean, I think that was part of Matthew Parris's argument. If you're sort of
I think Matthew's right.
50 with a mortgage, and this is the job, and you can't look around and don't see an immediate job for an ex-MP, then
and everybody was sort of broadly speaking assuming that we were trundling towards a 2022 election, and so you begin to make your life plans on that basis. I'm very much aware now that I may well be out of a job in November. It's quite a...
Okay, I'm going to go to audience questions. We'll come back again to ask things. So let's take things in let's do some little crops of whatever. We've got a couple of mics roving around. So do wait. Maddie, you want to come down here? Yeah.
Hi.
Tell us who you are. Yeah. No, yes, you.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. Hi Nick, Adam Payne from Business Insider. I'm just wondering, given there's a number of MPs in the Conservatives and Labour who are increasingly disillusioned with the state of their parties, their Brexit policy and their leaders or leaders-to-be, do you expect more MPs to follow your lead and quit their parties and sit as independents in the near future?
So we have got quite a lot of independents actually in this Parliament. It's one of the really quite interesting phenomena. Then to David.
Oh, sorry.
Should we get a second one and then I'll do both?
A second one,
David Haney, House of Lords. I wonder if you could just comment on the issue of the legislation that is stuck in the Commons at the moment, immigration, trade, agriculture, fisheries, to some of which at least does seem to be necessary to have on the statute book on the day after a no-deal exit, without which the statute book will not be able to function properly. Could you comment on that and comment on how that might provide a route of some kind?
Okay.
Thank you. Well, two very good questions.
Do those two? Should we do those two? And then we'll go back next.
We'll come back. So on the first, who knows? It's a very personal process, making a decision to leave your party. And each journey is, as it were, unique. I would be amazed if there weren't more over time, but where from, when, whether they do it together, whether it becomes part of a thing rather than just an individual journey, I wouldn't hazard a guess at this point. It's very interesting, this question of the legislation, and I hear I'm not a legislative expert, I hear different views about the extent to which they are absolutely prerequisite for Brexit being implemented, or whether they're just sort of inconvenient not to have them. And my sense is that they're inconvenient not to have them, and that probably a new Prime Minister would say, we'll leave on the 31st of October, and then we'll sort it all out. We'll have a few days of emergency legislation to sort out the statute book, and we'll back any judicial reviews in the meantime. I think that is my sense that I've got, and unless anybody has specific, provisions that they know cannot operate unless that legislation has been passed, my sense is that the new government will not bring forward anything that could be amended to attach a bill to do what we want to do until after Brexit.
Okay.
Do you agree? Or I'd be interested to know. Have you identified anything that looks...
No, I mean, there's been a lot of toing and froing about the trade deal.
Yeah.
The government's tended to say that they've got through statutory instruments enough to be going on with. Enough to be going on with.
Yeah.
But there are others who don't believe that. And I don't think that is a provable proposition. It's a matter of judgment, as all these things are. But I would be inclined to think that your guess as to where a new Prime Minister would go in these circumstances, given that at least one of the candidates is fairly reckless, I would agree with you.
At least one.
Okay, so just on Adam's question, Nick, what lessons are MPs taking out of the attempt of Change UK to form a new party? I don't know whether you ever flirted with them as a possibility or thought they were too committed to a second referendum, whatever, but it's quite interesting what's happened there and the sort of, splits and things like that.
I mean, I think that the object lessons of TIG Change and the Brexit Party are absolutely fascinating, and the depressing truth is that there are more positive lessons to learn from the Brexit Party than there are from TIG Change. I'm particularly attracted to the idea of having a party with no members, I have to say, after my own experience. But no, I think there's a serious point. I think that quite a lot of it was anticipatable. I mean, I don't want to break any confidences, and nor do I want to be disobliging about people who I genuinely admire enormously for the courage of what they did, the principle of what they did, the fact that they were trying to make a difference and create something new. I salute them totally. But as it happens, I was having a conversation with somebody who's thought about this whole question a lot, as have I, and we booked it on the day, as totally by chance, that they announced. And I said that I had 3 criteria for why I thought a new force might fail. And one of them was if it happened before the first stage of Brexit was over, not the long-term relationship, but the sort of, the withdrawal agreement. And secondly, if it defined itself as about a referendum and nothing else, more than, and thirdly, if it hadn't worked out in advance of launching who its leader was, what it stood for, what its brand was, what its pitch was. You can't, you can't make this up as you go along. Of course, it's going to evolve, but you've got to have an opening pitch that is absolutely buttoned down, and all of the conversation has happened before, for months, hopefully. And of course, they didn't do that because they sort of they bounced themselves, they were bounced by particular events and certain individuals, and so the heartbreaking thing is that I think that they could have succeeded, but I think that they made it very, very difficult for themselves.
Okay, let's take some more questions. So we've got Stephanie. Let's do Stephanie and then along the row. I'll do 2 at a time. Yes.
Okay. I'm Stephanie. I'm the London correspondent for German Welt. In the autumn, the pressure will also be on the E27, what to do, an enormous pressure to avoid no deal. Now, imagine Boris Johnson comes to Brussels and says, give me a tiny little bit on the backstop, and I guarantee you a majority in the House of Commons. And the price for EU is 27. I don't think it's going to happen, but they would throw Ireland under the bus. Terrible internal signal to all the other small member states, but whatever, no deal is worth the price. But how much could they rely on then really getting that deal over the line?
Okay. So, yes.
Hi, Katie Heafy, Department for Business. I'm a former constituent of yours from lovely Stamford. And just taking it back to you mentioned that you think you might be out of a job come November. On a local level, what the response has been to your move and things? Because I have my views on what the kind of locals are like there. And I'm wondering if that was borne out or not in the reception you've had.
Right, interesting. Okay, well, a very nice combination of questions. The first question, so my view is very clearly this, which is that Boris is going to be a prisoner just as much, if not more so, than Theresa May was. And the idea that Ian Duncan Smith and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Steve Baker and Mark Francois and Marcus Fish and, you know, and are going to be happy with a little something on the backstop. I mean, it's ridiculous. Let's be clear. If he could get it and that was enough, he'd go for it in a heartbeat. I mean, he has no commitment to anything he says or believes. So, of course, if he thought that that was a way to get the deal done and stay Prime Minister, he'd do it. But he won't be able to do it. He's going to be a prisoner. And I just don't see, you know, in the Venn diagram, I don't see any overlap between the circle of things that a majority of MPs, including overwhelmingly the majority of Conservative MPs, will vote for, and things that the EU could possibly concede without totally undermining its credibility and its internal cohesion. So personally, I think it's very, very unlikely. Frankly, I don't think it's any more likely for Jeremy Hunt. They might want to be nicer to Jeremy Hunt if he were to become Prime Minister, but I don't think it's going to be enough, whatever it is, to bring them over the line. I think the only thing that could, as it were, revive the withdrawal agreement in some form is if no-deal Brexit is closed off. If a no-deal Brexit is absolutely closed off, so that it is against the law for a Prime Minister to take us out on the 31st of October with a no-deal Brexit, which is obviously what our hope and our intention is, then that might change the dynamic, because suddenly then the only way of delivering Brexit is the withdrawal agreement. But while it remains true that there is this other perfect, no-compromise Brexit out there as a possibility, their ability to find a compromise that gets the ERG back on side. And remember, the ERG, having felt a bit on the back foot in March, when we managed to pass our bill and require the extension and everything else, you know, if Boris becomes Prime Minister, they're going to be cock-a-hoop. They're going to think, right, now finally we control the castle. They're not going to be in the mood for a compromise.
So Nick, what about all these sort of one nation? You can talk about Stamford. I just want to come back to you about these one nation or sort of one nation-ish. Not quite sure how meaningful that is. Tories who seem to be backing Boris. You say he's very much prisoner of the ERG, but there are some people who are not ERG signed up for whatever. He's created this coalition of, you know, maybe Matt Hancock, Damien Green on Newsnight, whatever, who say they're backing Boris. I mean, are they going along with this too? Or
he's a prisoner of the ERG, and they're a prisoner of their own ambition.
Okay.
Right, let's go back to my constituency. So I've had this weird experience in my constituency. So my constituency is a very small c conservative place. I used to joke with American friends who were always rather amazed when I told them that I said that I represented the equivalent of Orange County in England, which they found amazing, given that I was an openly gay and quite, you know, reasonably small L liberal kind of fellow. So it's small c conservative, and it was, you know, it's not like Boston, but it was nevertheless quite heavily in favour of Brexit. I think it was sort of 60-40. And obviously, and I have a majority of 20,000. My vote was 52%, I think, of the vote. So, you know, it's pretty much going to vote Conservative, whatever. So I'm under no illusion that even if I wanted to stand as an independent there, that I would have any chance of winning. I won't have any chance of winning. But what's been very interesting is that since what Chris Bryant calls my flounce across the floor of the House, since April the 1st, as it fortuitously was, the number of people who come up to me when I'm in town, you know, one of the towns doing surgeries on a Friday, is far higher than it ever was before. And pretty much every time I'm there, half a dozen people will come up to me and say, how are you, how's it going, really admire what you did, or thank you for doing this, or then of course, unfortunately, the conversation always ends with the immortal phrase, afraid I don't vote Conservative. So I think I'm very, very popular among a rather small minority of vocal, perhaps slightly more urban. I mean, Stamford in particular, but even in Grantham, I think you'll probably find the Remain vote is probably in the towns and the villages where, you know, I don't hold surgeries and therefore I'm less present or less visible. I suspect are a bit less pleased with me.
Okay, more questions. We've got, there seems to be nobody in the back who wants to come. So David, go to that lady, but let's come down here, Maddie. We'll do there first. Yeah. Yes.
I'm Derek Bates. I'm a writer. The Institute for Government, probably a decade ago, did a report which says that ministers should be trained. Did you not know that?
No, I do. I remember it.
It's never more apparent when Theresa May stands up in front of television and says, Jean-Claude Juncker is going to find that I am a bloody difficult woman. Now, if there's a way to start a negotiation badly, that is it.
I mean, I certainly was a big supporter of the IFG campaign for ministerial training, and indeed, as a baby junior minister, participated in it. I'm actually a fan of something which we tried to do, Chris Morin and I tried to do, and got seen off by David Cameron. It was that we wanted to do psychometric testing of all of the shadow ministers. Nothing, they all thought it was like the most appalling thing. Of course, any professional job now, one of the first things you do in an interview process is take one of the fairly standard tests to sort of try and establish what kind of personality you are. And it seemed to us a fairly logical thing. You're trying to build teams in departments to establish what is the sort of base material that you're working with. But politics is just, it's so old-fashioned, and it doesn't believe that it has anything to learn from any other walk of life. It's utterly maddening. But anyway. We
even did 360-degree appraisals of some ministers, so anyway. Yeah, we'll go there and then, yes.
Hi, Amelia Peterson. I'm a PhD student at Harvard. You started with a kind of historical analysis of why Brexit was maybe inevitable. If we ever got to the point where the ERG chokehold was broken in some way, would there ever be traction again for a sort of economic analysis of what we maybe should or shouldn't do? Or do you think that's just kind of fallen by the wayside as a way of thinking about what our relationship with Europe should be?
I mean, I think there's a much bigger question, which is how long is the populist cultural wave, nationalist populist cultural wave, going to run? And in the long run, I'm actually optimistic that ultimately it'll be found out, because it always is, and also ultimately liberal democracy will learn from its mistakes and find new tunes to sing, because it's pretty good at learning. But I think that the wave has got quite a lot of mileage left. I mean, certainly another 5 years or 5 years perhaps. In that time, I think that people they'll just be going la 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 la. The fear I have, if I'm being pessimistic, and I am quite pessimistic in the short term, is that we're now at a point where I'm beginning to think that actually we need to experience no-deal Brexit before all of the things that we've all been saying about, sheep farmers' tariffs and everything, that people actually need to experience it, and then hopefully may start thinking, well, maybe we should have listened to some of those people who said, and maybe we shouldn't, discount what the CBI says and the TUC says and the governor of the Bank of England and all of that. Maybe it's only by actually, eating the pudding that people will realise what's involved. Funnily enough, I do think that if people did, it would be, unbelievably painful damaging and, I suspect, cataclysmic for the Conservative Party, though I couldn't care less about that. But I think that, funnily enough, we'd probably work our way back to EEA EFTA membership within a couple of years. I mean, assuming the EU would be willing to negotiate something around that. I think there'd be quite quickly a view of, oh my Christ, what have we done? We need to get back to some of the building blocks without rejoining the EU. But it just seems to me so mad to put yourself through that when there's a perfectly reasonable destination that you can get to first. But I fear we may have lost our chance.
And would we do that as the UK, or would we do that as England,
Well,
having
I know.
lost...
I know. I think those are some of the many experiences that, you know, people will say, yeah, you keep on saying the union's going to split up. Well, you know, when you've lost one of them and the other one's looking a bit dicey, then maybe people will start listening.
Okay, Matt. Yeah.
Nick, I found your analysis of the two main parties and their relationship to their memberships absolutely compelling. It does seem to me, if you look back in history with both main parties, when they headed to the extremes, there was always resistance and a movement pulling them back into the centre, and I don't really observe that with either party at the moment. I also think, you know, on top of that, that we're in a position where you described waking up on May the 2nd, 97. I think quite a lot of people who are Labour voters woke up and felt the same way after the coalition was elected. And I find a huge number of people I know now describing themselves as politically homeless. Is there any realistic prospects for a new electorally successful party?
Wish I knew the answer. This is probably not the kind of film that people who come to talks at the Institute for Government on a lunchtime go to see. But I'm rather a fan of Guardians of the Galaxy. And Guardians of the Galaxy 2, I think. I'm trying to find the name of it. I've asked, this is sort of research I get my researcher to do, is that there's a particular run that he has to make through an asteroid system and all of that sort of stuff to get to somewhere in an impossibly short amount of time. And it involves sort of just judging everything completely perfectly. And I can't remember what it's called, but I'm longing to find the name. I think that very, very narrow, tiny probability, everything's got to go right, all of the stars have got to be aligned, is just possible this autumn. But not much longer. Because I think that it is conceivable that, this autumn, maybe next spring, but not in 2022. I think it's inconceivable that, firstly, I think it's more likely than not that we will leave with a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. That will then immediately define the mood of the country. It won't be about the last 2 years, it will be about current reality. I think it's myself unlikely that the Labour Party will organise themselves to shuffle Jeremy Corbyn on before then. They might in 2020 or 2021 and hand over to somebody else from the left, but I think in the next 6 months that's unlikely to happen. So I think it's just conceivable that you might have an election in which you've got Boris Johnson, who's just led the country into no-deal Brexit, fighting Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage, and you can imagine just possibly enough people feeling politically homeless that they all group on a piece of territory. Now then the question is that piece of territory the Lib Dems and Jo Swinson, or is it that plus something else? And I have no idea. But I think it's a very, very narrow chance. I suspect that if it doesn't happen then things will probably go back to some kind of normality, in that eventually the Labour Party will elect somebody who isn't Jeremy Corbyn, and yes, it will be somebody more left than we're used to, but, you know, if it's Angela Rayner, I think a lot of people who are totally fed up with the Tory party and hate Brexit will think, yeah, I can live with an Angela Rayner premiership. And so I think you'd then have the Tories out, you know, probably Brexit party in with 20 seats, and Angela Rayner. But that's in a few years' time. In this next period of time, I think there might be that opportunity, but it's not easy to do.
But
as Tig explained.
But your sequencing is definitely that we might get a general election after a no-deal Brexit, because the Prime Minister still is a minority Prime Minister, can't get anything done.
Yeah.
If you do that, get some of David's bills through, these bits of legislation that are waiting for Parliament to be prorogued and come back again, whatever. Rather than, if you're faced with the prospect of definitely Parliament blocking no deal, the Prime Minister then goes for a no deal versus Remain general election.
Clearly,
or a referendum.
both are possible. I genuinely think that for once Boris is actually saying something he believes when he says that we cannot have an election before Brexit. Because I think he knows that Nigel Farage will just make total mincemeat of him.
And no second referendum? Not going to say, well, Parliament's blocking me and putting it back to the people? Tell them again?
It's not impossible, but I doubt it.
OK, I'm going to take 3 questions, sort of final round, she says. Yes.
Thanks. Chris Carr from the Department for Business. You talked earlier about the coalition agreement and the ability of people to sit down and talk to each other from opposite sides. And I wondered whether you thought there was an argument to be made for an electoral system that requires that to happen slightly more often, as it does in the European countries you were referring to.
OK, and then Peter, and then here. Yeah. Do all 3 at once.
Peter Wilson-Smith from Meritus. You talked about the importance of the Conservative Party acting in the interests of not just the rich elderly members, but a broader constituency. I mean, in a sense, Brexit is a sort of classic example of that policy in action. I mean, I can't think of any issue in my lifetime where there's been such a stark generational divide. A clear majority above 50 for Leave, a clear majority below for Remain. Among the new voters, 7-1 against. And my question is, I mean, do you slightly worry perhaps that, by still trying to sort of push through some kind of sensible Brexit, you're complicit in an extreme example of intergenerational unfairness? And now that the polls have shown a distinct change towards a majority for Remain, what would get you to say a second referendum is a sensible policy now?
OK, thank you. Should we just pass it forward? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. In 2016, you discussed about immigration. And last year, I covered a Conservative Party conference, and you discussed about free trade and pro-business and Adam Smith. But now you discuss about 1,000-year statecraft legacy, and why discussion is changing.
Oh, there's some interesting questions there. So firstly, electoral reform. So I've always been against it. I had no problem, in a sense, in the coalition, because I thought that of all of the options, alternative vote was had the least to recommend it. That my view was, if you're going to have a proportional system, then have a damn proportional system. Don't have one that can be even more weird than the one we've got. And I do genuinely believe that the constituency link is a powerful strength, and not just a powerful strength, it's actually just a defining feature of our politics, and you'd give it up. So, in a sense, my minimum bar would be I would require a proportional system that retained the constituency link as to as much as possible. But I think it is clearly the case that if we move to a position where we have, as the polls currently suggest, 4 parties on 20% each, then it's no longer even vaguely justifiable. But the truth is always been, has always been the case, is still the case, which is you've got to win under the old system in order to change the system, and there's nothing that's ever going to change that. But I think, having said that, I think a minority Labour government with SNP and Lib Dem and Plaid support is likely to bring in some kind of a proportional system, and I think that won't be necessarily a bad thing. The point of, am I complicit by backing a form of Brexit? rather than a second referendum. It's a very reasonable question and a reasonable charge. I mean, I don't feel guilty about it, because I do believe that old people's votes count as much as young people's votes, and it was one person, one vote in that referendum, and the majority was clear. On the other hand, I have been clear and remain in this position, which is that Theresa May's deal was the hardest Brexit that I am willing to countenance. Now, I preferred a softer one, which is EEA-EFTA, but hers was the hardest. And if that is definitively off the table, then I could move to saying, well then, okay, because I'm not in the business of revoking. I don't think you can revoke without asking the people again. So that would lead me to backing to a referendum. While there was any chance of a softer Brexit happening, I personally felt that was the best way of responding to the referendum, and indeed to this fundamental historical position that we find ourselves in, without actually doing ourselves real harm. But if that disappears, then I think I might well find that that's the only position left to me. On this point about, you know, as it were, the changing conversation. Now, obviously, sir, I'm no longer a Conservative, so I've got that delicious freedom of being an observer. But the truth is, it's a bigger shift. You know, for the moment, how long for, don't know. Economics is not what we're talking about, and not why we're voting, and it's not the analysis that persuades us on things. It's culture. And I think that, you know, Mr. Abe in Japan knows that, God knows, and has, you know, yes, economics matters, yes, Abenomics matters, but actually a lot of his appeal has been an appeal to some cultural roots and traditions and identity. And that is true in Turkey and Hungary and Brazil, in the Philippines, I mean, you know, it's true all over the world. And I think it's a fairly historically explainable reaction to a very, very deep economic crash. That people start reaching for other certainties that perhaps they feel have been overlooked. And the Tory party has sort of got caught up with that, with all of this stuff about sovereignty and Parliament and the endless talk about the Second World War and Dunkirk and, you know, D-Day. And I mean, nobody reveres that generation more than me, but the relevance of it to what we're currently going through is literally zero.
So final question for me, Nick. Political system looking a bit shaky and ropey. We've already discussed electoral reform. We've had these big tussles between the executive and Parliament. Is there a sort of Bowles parting manifesto for rebooting the political system, changing membership of party or whatever? Should we just all join, like Nick Clegg said? We should have all joined the Tory party. Maybe if that had happened, it'd be a different leadership election now. But how do we revitalise the political parliamentary system? We need to do that.
I mean, I'm not going to be coy about it. I would like there to be a new force in British politics that was not a membership-controlled organisation, that was porous, that was, yes, it stood as a party, because you have to stand as a party to stand candidates in elections, but that was a movement that allowed people to belong to more than one movement, that had, as I recommended in a little book I wrote in 2010, you know, had a coupon arrangement at the next general election with the Liberal Democrats, whereby Liberal Democrat candidates were the candidates of this movement, and Liberal Democrats backed the other candidates of this movement in the seats where they weren't originally Liberal Democrats. That is my sort of sublime ideal. But, you know, wishing these things is one thing, making them happen is quite a lot harder.
Okay, well, that seems the point to end. So, Nick, it's been great to have you while you're still an MP.
Just.
Hopefully not just, well, that's a prediction about elections and stuff like that and whatever. Stand as an independent somewhere. It'd be fun. Be the first person in your new movement. Could you all join me in thanking Nick for joining us at lunchtime?
Thank you.